All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for having me here. I'm super excited. I was talking to Eric earlier today about why this is a particularly exciting conference for me, and it's because if we can essentially accelerate development of cool new shit in the world, it will be awesome from a personal perspective as well, right? So I think this is a selfish reason, but also one that I hopefully will be good for the world. So, cool. So we live in really interesting times. If you kind of think about, especially in my industry, in the technology industry, we've kind of gone from a world where 40 years ago, nobody had any computers, there was no internet, to now we have about 2 billion people who have access to computing and connectivity for the first time. And it's pretty cool because it took about 30 years for the first billion people to get access to computing and connectivity. Then this came out, and it took about 10 years for the second billion people to get access to computing and connectivity. But even more remarkable is in the next 10 years, half the world will get access to this stuff that we know and we take for granted, which is ubiquitous access to information, the ability to communicate with anyone. They'll get access to this for the first time. Why is this interesting? Because what this means is that products are spreading faster than ever, right? So you think about that next 3 billion, they're going to be using Facebook, they're going to be using Dropbox, and that's going to happen. It's going to happen in the course of 10 years. Basically, the markets are going to be tripled, right? But I find it really interesting because it also means that companies are growing faster than ever. Using that 1 billion metric, it took Microsoft about 35 years and about 100,000 employees to get to 1 billion users. It took Google about 15 years, and I want to say about 60,000 employees. It took Facebook 8 years with only 10,000 employees. So clearly, we can actually get a lot done with smaller teams, right? So, okay, it's actually funny because I had this slide up there, and Eric was basically talking about it. As I've read a bunch of those management texts that Eric was talking about, and most of them actually preach your job as a manager is to provide stability. And if you want to evolve the company, do it gradually, do it slowly. But then when I try to apply those in my job, if a company is essentially growing 2x, 3x over the course of 6 months, how am I supposed to provide stability? It's simply not possible. So the management mantra that I have is basically everything's going to be a little bit broken. Okay? You just want to make sure it's not too broken. And you want to have a mindset that you're constantly identifying what's broken, fixing it, and iterating from it. Cool. So why am I here talking to you about this? So I've had the incredible privilege and opportunity to work at 2 hypergrowth companies. I was pretty early at Facebook. I was in the first 15 people there. And yeah, that was a pretty wild ride. It was a pretty good rocket ship. So when I got there, we were basically building a social directory for college students, literally a Facebook, right? And over the course of, I was there for about 6 years, we grew the company from 15 people to about 2,500 people on a bunch of different products. And it's pretty amazing that today Facebook is actually building drones that's going to beam down connectivity to the whole world, which is pretty insane, right? I've been at Dropbox for about 4 years now, and in that time period, we have grown the company from about 75 people to about 1,500 today, serving over 400 million users. So that's also been fun. So what I'm going to be talking to you about today is essentially how we have evolved the company, both at Facebook and Dropbox, across a bunch of different aspects of engineering management. So I'm going to be telling you about recruiting. I'm going to be telling you about how we approach product development, and also how we think about the evolving nature of leads at our company. And what's interesting for me here is I'm going to be talking to you about how we used to do things and how we do things today. And I mean this not because the way we do things today is perfect, but the way that it has to keep on evolving. And the way we do things today has to evolve 12 months down the line as well. But hopefully it'll give you an interesting kind of side by side. So I want to talk about values for a second, because so far what you've heard from Eric and the first speaker is that you have to keep on changing things up, right? But in the process of doing so, you still need some North Star. You still need something at the company that has to remain grounded and has to essentially remain constant as you kind of go through this hypergrowth. And what we found at both Facebook and Dropbox is that North Star are our company values. And company values are one of those things where you have to really think hard about the value that is appropriate for your particular company. There is no right or wrong value, right? So I'll give you an example from Facebook. Probably the most famous example is move fast and break things. That's kind of crazy, right? What kind of software engineer wants to write code that might break? Like, we're kind of built up in a world where you kind of have this entire process of you write, you test, you release. And Facebook, we were like, well, we need to scale the company really quickly. Facebook as a product, even if it's perfect, even if it's bug-free, is kind of useless unless you have the whole world on it. So we're just going to create a culture that values shipping over everything else, even if it means that it's going to be a little bit buggy. I don't think we actually knew what we were actually getting into when we said that. But once we actually had this value, our entire company was oriented around essentially shipping code 3 times a day, if not continuous deployment, figuring out we would do bug management essentially live by looking at the error logs and fixing bugs as they came up. And these are all kind of crazy setups for most software engineers. Cool, so that worked for Facebook. Now, if you think about applying that same value to Dropbox, imagine if your Dropbox basically, God forbid, if you lost data once out of every 10,000 times, or if your Dropbox was slow or not performant once out of every 10,000 times, you'd think your computer was broken. Literally, you would actually throw away a computer because you're my hard drive is buggy, right? And instead at Dropbox, we have a value called sweat the details, because we think that the particular area that we're in means that you have to get that last 10% right. And this is actually, sweating the details actually flies in the face of a lot of modern development methodology. Because most of the time nowadays you hear that, you hear companies actually doing stuff the Facebook way. But at Dropbox, we're no, we kind of need to do stuff a little bit the older way. So the question for us is, how do we find the right balance in terms of we still want to move fast, but we need to make sure that we don't break things. So it's interesting, and I bring these two up because they're pretty radically different. And it means that there is no one right value for your company. So you have to think pretty hard about what is the value that epitomizes the product that you need to build, and hence the culture that you need to have. Cool. And values are the gift that keeps on giving, because once you can write them down, you actually can inject them throughout your company in terms of how to evaluate candidates, in terms of actually performance management, and so on. Cool. Let's talk about recruiting. So when you're pretty young, when your company is 10 or 15 people, or your team is 10 or 15 people, what you really want to be maximizing for is finding people who are generalists, who are really good learners, and who are not afraid of essentially picking up new things that they have no idea that they needed, right? This is not an easy skill to hire for. So the question that we often ask ourselves is, how do we set up an interview process that filters for learning? And it's not an easy thing, because it's actually easy to set up an interview process that filters for what people already know. But what you're trying to find out is, how will you test them for what they can know in the future? As opposed to, over time, when you're larger, when you actually have an install base of hundreds of millions of users, then you need to find people who might have been specialists at this one particular thing that you need to figure out how to scale and have been doing it for the last 10 years. Those people are actually your unicorns of today. But then the question is, every technology company also wants to do new things. So how are you going to have an interview process that can actually strike the balance between these two things? And I think this is a challenge that we are facing right now. We haven't figured this out. Because in the attempt to scale out your recruiting, you will have this evaluation criteria. And you set this up so that your entire team knows how to evaluate, knows how to ask these interview questions. But then how are you going to do both? Because we also want to be a startup, right? We also want to essentially ship new products that we haven't dreamed of today. It's not easy. Cool. Product development process. I love this slide. Chaos is OK, because in the beginning, you don't need any process. Because people don't often stop and ask, what is the point of process? The point of process is pretty easy. It's communication, and it's coordination. When you're in a room, when everybody is literally in the same room, you get all of that shit for free. You literally don't need to actually send out these complicated emails, have these sprint plans, and so on. But as you get larger, you're going to have to change it up, because when you have hundreds of people, you do need to communicate. You do need to coordinate. How else are you going to essentially maximize throughput across that entire team? So what we try to do is we try to like institute process as far down as we can, down the line as we can, and we try really hard to formalize stuff that's already happening organically. It makes my job easier. I don't have to say I came up with something. I'm just like, you're already doing this. I'm just going to put a name on it, and I'm going to formalize it, and we'll all do it now. Interestingly, how do you create a company that has annual budgeting, quarterly business reviews, has like monthly planning, or we call it sprints planning, and apply that to something that we want to do internally that doesn't have product market fit yet? We have the same challenge. Like, we set up this like whole system that works really well for the 400 million users, but we have stuff internally that today has 0 users. And that's crazy, right? Like, you think of Dropbox, you think it's a successful company, but we have multiple products internally today that have 0 users. So how are we going to strike the balance between both building a product at scale and doing something that has 0 users? That's not easy. Leads. So on the left, you have basically what your initial set of leads at a company is going to be, or your managers. And these are not your traditional definition of managers. These are probably the people in your team who are the most technically savvy, or maybe have been around for a while. They're probably not going to be great at doing all of the things that managers do, which is instituting process, scaling the team, communicating, and coordinating. But they're going to allow you to move really fast because they understand the code base. They have a lot of like organic support within the team. And over time, what is going to happen? If your company is successful, what it'll mean is that the role of a manager will change really quickly. This happens really, really quickly. It could happen in the course of, honestly, like 6 months. Somebody who's leading a team and doing really well is now no longer cut out for the job. And this is really hard because this is the person who's probably was your best performer, and now in 6 months, they're like, well, I don't even like the job anymore. Why did I become a manager in the first place? So how do you set up an organization that recognizes this and celebrates this when this happens? Because most of the times, like, you set up an organization, the natural gravity is towards, like, if you're a manager, you're doing well. You're going to get a lot of recognition. But how do you also set up an organization when somebody goes from engineer to manager to engineer again? This is success. This is good. Like, you need to be able to have both. Oops, sorry. I don't think we have Q&A. But that's essentially the last slide. And what I'm trying to get across to all of you is that the big thing that you can take is even companies like Facebook and Dropbox, we haven't figured it out. There is no like perfect system. These are both pretty cool companies, but the thing that we do have is an incredible like penchants for change, and introspecting and understanding that we're not afraid to like switch this up. We're not afraid to like challenge ourselves and to think from first principles about what is not just good for the entire company, but what is good for a particular team within the company. And let's not be afraid to like essentially recognize that companies have to evolve, and there is no one right model. So that's all I have. Thank you very much for having me.